This afternoon, I'm going to be talking about the lived experience of diverse SOGIESC communities across the Pacific. And this is off the back of a research project that was developed in partnership with a peak body in the Pacific region. And we're looking at diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and sex characteristics. And that's what we mean with SOGIESC. And it's a term that's generally been used across different international platforms. I too, as per the intro, also would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded lands of the Gadigal people. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So this particular research project took place over the last 12 to 18 months, and it was a partnership that occurred between the Pacific Sexual and Gender Diversity Network, PSGDN, the University of Sydney, and the University of the South Pacific. And basically, we were commissioned to do two particular research projects that then resulted in these two particular reports. And I just realized I'm going to start recording myself, and I will also do the woohoo for the 2 minutes as well. So I'm going to watch myself. So these particular reports, again, are a reflection of two particular research projects. The first one was looking at the lived experience of PID-SOGIESC, so Pacific Island people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, experiences, and sex characteristics plus. And then we also then did an additional project called the experience of LGBTQ plus women across the Pacific. So I'm just going in my time unpack both of those particular research projects with view to just further highlight some of those diverse perspectives, ways of looking at the world, and understandings that we may learn but also embrace as part of this shared approach. Now, I should just note that one of the reasons why I got involved in this particular project alongside Dr. Joel Hollier and Mr. Malachi Wanga from the University of the South Pacific was when PSGN originally approached me off the back of my previous research. My written work was looking at how gender and sexual identities, especially sexual identities, were fluid before colonization in the Pacific. So I did a lot of stuff around that, even did a TED talk on that, and they'd seen that and they wanted to then look at how we can reshift those narratives. So the approach to this research project was definitely looking at the challenges, so the lived experience of our queer communities, in which I'm also part of, but also looking at our strengths, the capabilities, the capacities, our solutions that can come from our pre-colonial queer perspectives. So that was really the baseline of our research project, was to not just, again, sit in the challenges, because there's lots of challenges that do exist for our queer communities, but it was also looking at how do we continue to mobilize possibilities beyond that as well. So I just want to start by just highlighting that one of the things that we wanted to do across both projects was highlight that even within Pacific languages, we have our own terms that help understand the diverse ways in which we see our own gender and sexual identities. So the notion of LGBTIQA+ is a Western construct. So within our own Pacific epistemologies and ontologies, we have our own language and terminology, and you can see some of those terms that we strive to privilege in the context of our understanding of how we do and see and interact with the world. And that includes things like the MVP FAFF+ acronym, which you can see down the bottom there. And that is also incorporating our own terms like mahu and whakasalewalewa and whawhawhine and whaitama as well. So all of those various terms that we use to describe diverse sexual and gender identities is really an important part of this research, so that we're not seeing the research from a Western gaze, even though that generally is how we perceive things in a lot of these contexts. It was about reshifting that as well as part of capturing those particular narratives. So let me go to the first research project, and this was more of a quantitative research project And this is where we adapted the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights survey that they've done previously with LGBT communities. How we adapted it was we sent it out to our different community members that are part of the Pacific Sexual and Gender Diversity Network, PSGDN network. So there's about 23 countries across the Pacific that are members. And we asked local communities to review what the survey tool looks like. Ideally, if we had more time, we would have really reviewed and actually revised our own survey. But because this research was funded by the EU initially, they wanted us to mobilize a tool that they knew. But nonetheless, we tried to adapt the questions and some of the language within the survey so that it would actually be helpful for local communities. As part of the shared approach, we also looked through our funding in employing local survey assistants in each of those different Pacific islands who were part of the queer communities themselves, so that we're also empowering the network and the peers amongst the community to be involved as survey assistants. There were 619 initial survey responses that were collected over a 4-month period. So that was only a 4-month period that we had, and that's quite a large survey response per se, especially for the timelines that we had. But in total, we had 466 of those initial survey responses completed across the 23 countries. And you can see from one of the first demographic information that there was a good representation of people that participated or fairly participated. If you look at the sexual orientation, the intersex status, and more so the gender identity, especially the gender identity, you'll see a good sort of mix in the context of responses. So in this particular report, there were 6 key areas that we were able to look at via the survey, but we added again some of the additional information around the strengths and the capabilities. So some of the things that we saw, and again, this report is made publicly available very shortly, we were able to look at the demographics of PID-SOGIESC communities. So I should note that this was the first of its kind. We haven't actually done this sort of survey or data previously in the region. So that's why we did get a lot of interest from our local communities. We looked at daily life, and that includes how they interact with local health services and the way in which they may access those particular provisions. But then we started to explore some of the key areas around discrimination. And that also includes how they interact with social systems, structures, and services. Experience of harassment within society. We also looked at data associated with recounting instances of violence, physical and sexual assaults, and threats of violence. But lastly, we looked at the advocacy and involvement in PID-SOGIESC movements. And we found that generally, despite a lot of the various challenges that our communities face across the region, there was a strong turn up of advocacy. Despite the challenges that they had, they saw their own allyship across the diverse gender and sexualities as an important part of advocating, not just for self, but others. And that really highlighted that collectivist context that we as Pacific Indigenous people continue to also operate within and across. So some of the, and I do apologize, this is relatively small, but some of the recommendations that came from the survey was legislation. We need to make sure that legislation continues to promote the rights of PID-SOGIESC people across the region, and legislation that is responsive. Not just legislation that is defined by Western discourses around decriminalisation or gay marriage or rights for adoption, which is something that Tanya, one of our PhD students, presented on earlier today, very similar to what's the experience in Africa. There's similarities to what we're seeing in the Pacific as well. But in the Pacific, there's this misinformation around, well, that's what LGBTIQA rights is. You just want to get married to each other, right? And it's like, no, there's more than that, because you're using the Western framing of rights rather than what is it to understand our rights as Pacific people. The second recommendation is focusing energy on training and equipping public servants, so really workforce development stuff. So how do we ensure police, teachers, health workers, politicians understand the rights, but their responsibilities when it comes to engaging our communities? We have the access to healthcare services is quite low amongst trans and intersex individuals. So how do we ensure that we deter barriers, but we also promote health-seeking behaviour and health literacies more broadly? In the fourth recommendation, there's a few options for recourse of victims of discrimination, especially when the discrimination is perpetrated by those in power. So accounts of people being discriminated by virtue of them turning up to police and police saying things like, well, you brought it upon yourself, so why are we helping you? So a lot of those narratives continue to permeate various discourses across our social systems and structures in the Pacific. And there, of course, are nuances in each of these different countries. The next recommendation was about being able to equip our communities to understand our rights, especially when it comes to employment, education, and how we continue to empower each other around those particular areas. And the last recommendation is how do we continue to mobilize our own strengths, our capabilities, our capacities to inform the way in which we create those solutions moving forwards. So that's the first report. Again, that was based on the survey data. The second research was about being able to look at the experience of LGBTQ plus women. And this was this was a qualitative project. So this is where I then undertook Talanoa, so focus groups, but Talanoa is a Pacific concept that talks about being able to hold space. So it's a Pacific Indigenous methodology, but it's also a way of life and practice. So a Talanoa is to hold a space where you can talk about anything, everything, nothing at all. And so I traveled across the various islands in the middle of last year and undertook several Talanoa sessions with participants who I identified via their particular sexual orientations or gender expression, their pronouns, and how they describe themselves with their own sexuality. So it was really, really important, again, that we privilege their own perspectives, because once again, sometimes even when it comes to this understanding of trans communities, even that is quite diverse in the way in which trans people in the Pacific perceive themselves and their pronouns and their sexuality, because it's very fluid at times, but also quite diverse, not fixed. So that's why we wanted to ensure that that was representative. The other key thing, of course, we wanted to privilege LGBTQ, so lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer plus women, to ensure that their voices, and again, we worked very closely with such community members and representatives to ensure that we were doing these Talanoa sessions in a helpful way. So went to PNG, went to Solomon Islands, went to Vanuatu, went to Fiji, went to Tonga, and went to Samoa to undertake those particular Talanoa sessions. And people were so generous. And the sessions literally, on average, went for 3 hours each, literally, where I sat there with a recorder and they just held and shared space to talk about anything, everything, and nothing at all. Here are some of our key findings. So things like resilience. So hearing stories of resilience and things like, being trans doesn't mean that I'm not able to move to and through other parts of the community. So I'm able to turn up and use this particular strength of my gender expression in this part of the community and this part of my gender expression in another part of the community. So it was this idea of being able to have that resilience. Also, this resilience of being able to help others because of the resilience that you have by virtue of being considered as the outer. We also looked at the experience of discrimination and violence. So a lot of the other participants, I should note also that a lot of our participants were also actively involved in sex work. And that was the other emphasis that we had in the context of participants. We wanted to invite people who are also in sex work to actually participate also in the research project. And they intersect, again, across those gender and sexual identities. So we heard a lot of heavy stuff in regards to how they're treated, how they have to maintain certain strategies, especially on social media, as part of their well-being. We looked at risks on, so I've got 2 minutes now. Risks on the horizon, so things like climate change and climate inaction from other areas of the Pacific. And how do we then continue as queer communities who are constantly overrepresented when it comes to disasters and natural disasters, even to the point where the wider community in different islands will go, the reason why we're receiving all these issues is because of the gays, is because of the queers, is because of yous. So we then continue to then get left behind. Interestingly enough, though, the ones that are the ones that are the loudest activists who are doing all the climate activism in the Pacific are queer themselves. So it's blows my mind at times in the sense of, what do you want, people? In the sense of we're helping to represent and advocate, but at the same time, you're leaving us behind. Number 4, exploring the journey of fitting in. So this idea of how do we also continue to understand our role in collectivist cultures and contexts, and then also looking at our various strengths and opportunities. And that includes how do we mobilize our Pacific Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, including that sense of reciprocal living and strength-based approaches. So some of the key recommendations included things like community advocacy groups continue to be established and resourced, policymakers and legislators having strong ethical responsibility to ensure SOGIESC communities are included in the consultation of legislation and policy. That support groups in the local context should continue to champion these particular narratives to also nuance and to understand some of those stigmas and discriminations. And across the board, a strength-based approach should be occurring, and reviving Indigenous Pacific ways of knowing and doing as part of our approach. And I'll end by these 2 quotes to just highlight, perfect, some of those key concepts that we're just talking about. So you're useful because you're doing your part. And that seems to be why we continue to make sense of it the only way, because that's how our cultural Indigenous protocols and traditions and practices have always been, active participation. So this idea that people generally didn't care what your gender or sexual identity was, as long as you just turning up and helping out. That was the common theme that we saw across the islands. And the last one, they can learn from our hearts like this. When the LGBT community comes together to do a work or to do something, we do it with all we have, to the best and to the perfect as the perfect as it is. We're all there. We all have each other's backs. And that really talks about this idea of mainstream society, both Pacific and non-Pacific, could learn a lot about how we as Pacific queer people, you know, continue to advocate for each other, and how we all, as part of that collectivist effort in trying to be part of something bigger, can be mobilized because of that idea of standing up for self and others, which again comes through a lot through the lived experience of queer communities across the Pacific, and their desire to continue to be engaged with and alongside. Thank you so much, everybody. Comments or... Oh, thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yes.
Just wondering, is that you mentioned there's specific terms used for specific people. Is there an equivalence between the terms there and terms that we would use in a Western?
So interesting, yes. Interesting, yes. So the term, for example, wakasalewa lewa means to be like a woman, right? But it's interesting because people will say that that is like a trans term, but people who are wakasalewa lewa will say, no, that's both my gender and my sexuality. So my wakasalewa lewa status is also my sexuality. Same with the Faitama, which is in Samoa, trans men, same sort of thing. My gender expression is as a Faitama, as like a man, but that's my sexuality as well. So that's why that table before around people identifying on you know what because that's why I asked when we did the intros, how would you like to be understood, as opposed to we're going to tell you how you should be understood.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah. Lubna and Tanya.
So in those conversations, did the participants speak about external or Western ideas filtering into how they understand their identities?
Very much so. So in each of the Talanoa sessions, they talked about colonization and how it really did F them up, in the sense of we know we're trying to what's the word? So we're really trying to we want to use our own Pacific Indigenous perspectives on sexuality. So there's a reclamation of those Pacific perspectives in trying to understand. But unfortunately, a lot of those Western religious perspectives have permeated the way in which we make sense of gender and sexual identities. So people speak about it and they know about it, but at the same time, it's that catch-22 of going, well, if we want to play with the global audience, we then also have to then continue to use language and terms and perspectives that the West is putting on us. So it's a real catch-22 at times, where it's like we don't want to create too much dissonance with our Western overlords, because we expect them to, there's an idea that we need to receive some support and funding. But it's about, it's a catch-22, again, similar to what was shared earlier today by Tanya Ditfield.
Yeah.
Yep. I can just say it really resonates in terms of the self-identifications and the being caught between a rock and a hard place. But, in regards to the first research, I was wondering what were some of the main changes that the communities wanted to have made to the survey, and were there any challenges in making those changes in relation to the funder, the EU?
Some of the changes was around how people understood health needs and health literacies. So in a lot of, similar to First Nations communities here in Australia, our health needs are seen holistically. So it's beyond the pathologizing of, the biomedical model that we use in the West. So it was about shifting the language in some of those areas around health literacies and around how we get support, because it's like this idea of, if you don't fit in, then you have to leave your family and you find a new family. But for a lot of Pacific people, you can't do that. Your family is your family because that's your identity. So it's almost like you don't disguise your sexuality. To be honest with you, sexuality is generally not discussed anyway, irrespective of whether you're queer or not. You just get on with it, right? But at the same time, it was this idea that we want to be known to still be connected to our family, as opposed to feeling like we have to be individuals in the context of our health outcomes. That's right. So even that notion of finding it chosen by, because again, that notion of our cultural connection to community will always generally be privileged outside of finding elsewhere. And despite the challenges of people feeling even though they might get discriminated against by their parents and their family members, they'll still turn up because it's their mum, their dad, their siblings.
And in relation to making those changes with the EU?
Oh, we would love to do that. Yeah, in the future. So we would love to continue to look at developing further nuanced research in this space, so that we can start to also put together tools. We're delighted that we use Talanoa, obviously, for the qualitative, but for the quantitative, yes, we are looking at possible opportunities to further nuance that in the future. And I might ask myself that last question. Oh, was there any other question? No.
What is it? You ask yourself. So I was thinking, actually, when you asked Lubna and I, it was kind of a leading question about rights. And I was thinking about then you critiquing a kind of rights framework as a Western framework. Why were you pushing us down that path?
But it's just one and the same thing. No, it's one and the same thing that I saw the thread when you first said it at the beginning around it's critiquing. Like, I think that all three presentations, it feels like I'm doing the outro now, but I feel like the presentations that we're seeing today, including this one, looks at critiquing the dominant discourses in how we understand rights and roles and responsibilities, and questioning the status quo. Questioning the status quo around healthcare needs, questioning the status quo around youth justice, questioning the status quo of understanding gender and sexual identities more broadly, let alone in a Indigenous Pacific perspective. But it's all underpinned, I think, by this idea of valuing what rights mean, but again, within a local context.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good luck, everyone.